All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to get an update on both cannabis and arts policy. So with that, I'll turn it over to the administration. Other council members will be joining us shortly. Deputy Mayor, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. We think the sequence will be cannabis first and then arts second. And we're probably going to look at maybe 40 minutes for cannabis and 20 minutes for arts, because the cannabis is more complex and frankly a higher priority that we have better understanding immediately. So with that, I'll turn it over to the cannabis folks to lead us through.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. We are the cannabis folks, I guess. Thanks to all the council members for joining us today, and thanks to James and Katie and Josanne, as always, for helping set this up. And we do have sort of unique circumstances today where I guess they're running a 2-for-1 sale on city policies. So we're going to be covering cannabis and the arts today. And both of those issues are things that the Office of City Planning is involved with. So we have a group of folks with us today that are working on one or both of those initiatives with us, including Heather Anderson from the City Planning Office, Johanna Brennan from Law, Linda Kingsley, Corporation Counsel, John Brock from the Mayor's Office, and of course the Deputy Mayor has been kind of with us all along with these things. I think I got everybody here. So
Tom Worth.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Tom Worth from Law as well. So everyone's played a really important role in each of these things. So we will start with cannabis, and you'll see how in both cases there are some items that will be coming before City Council. So we want to, one, just make sure you're up to speed on what's going on with these initiatives, but two, be fully aware of the actual council items that will be coming before you in the near future. So starting with cannabis, and if I could get permission to share my screen, that would be great. Now, I did have a couple of opening jokes that I was workshopping around this issue, and then I realized, oh, this is streaming live on YouTube, and I thought maybe best to just stick to the presentation today, Kevin. But yeah, there's a lot of great things happening on both fronts, and we do have slide decks for both of those. So I don't know if that would be you, James, or yeah, okay, I got it now.
It's done. Yep, you have it.
Thank you, sir. Let me get my screen set up. But does not want to. Okay, so we've got a sort of a few different folks that are going to be contributing to this presentation, and I'll turn it over to Linda here to give you some background on this initiative.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, so the law, what's referred to as MRTA, you'll hear that reference, which is the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, was adopted in 2021. And we'll talk in a bit about what that allowed. But that was the law that was adopted that made marijuana legal in New York State. The State Office of Cannabis Management was established. They're essentially, the easiest way to look at them is they're the marijuana equivalent of the State Liquor Authority in terms of them being the control regulatory agency that will deal with marijuana in New York State. One of the distinct differences between the SLA and this is there is a strong equity focus related to the establishment of the legalization of marijuana and the process for issuing licenses. Go to the next slide. As you can see from the list, there are a number of different licenses that the state will be issuing, everything from cultivator, processor, distributor, dispensaries, on-site consumption, and those two are in bold. You'll see as we talk about it, because those are the ones we're focusing on. Delivery, there will be the equivalent of Grubhub for marijuana sales in New York State. Nursery, a micro business, which is a small business that covers all phases, as it says, from seed to sale, and cooperatives, which are all phases except dispensing. The state law, let me tell you a couple of things before we get to that. The state law does allow the use of marijuana in New York State and the possession of marijuana in New York State for personal use. 3 ounces that you can carry with you, up to 5 pounds that you can possess for personal use in your home. The general principles of use in New York State are that you can use marijuana anywhere that you can smoke cigarettes. Municipalities had until December 31st of 2021 to opt out of allowing dispensaries or consumption lounges in their property, within their jurisdiction. The city of Rochester did not opt out of either of those. So both dispensaries and consumption lounges will be allowed to be licensed in the city of Rochester. The state agency, the Office of Cannabis Management, is the one that will grant the licenses. Local governments will be asked to comment, just as we're asked to comment on liquor licenses, but the licensing decisions will exclusively be made by the state. That is different than some other states in the country. What we do have power over for dispensaries and for consumption lounges is what's referred to as time, place, and manner regulations. We can regulate, again, for dispensaries and consumption lounges, issues related to time, place, and manner. We can regulate as long as it does not make operations impracticable. What that means is a subjective term, but basically if we created regulations that were too burdensome, that would make it difficult to find locations or to operate a profitable business, that would be deemed to be impracticable in all likelihood by the state. Time. Let's just talk a very little bit about what time, place, and manner means. The state may end up setting hours for these businesses. They have not done so yet. So we are proceeding as if we will have the power to control the hours. If the state ultimately does control them, we'll be bound by the state regulations. Place is simply what it sounds like, zoning. And as I think Kevin will talk more about later, we are choosing to treat them like businesses, which we think is the most legally reasonable route to go. Dispensaries will be treated like retail in zoning. Consumption lounges will in large part be treated like bars. Manner refers to things like the state will be controlling windows and signage. The state will be controlling frontage of buildings. They have to be street facing first floor buildings. And the state will be controlling some advertising issues. We will be allowed to control things like odors, security, parking, crowds, those kinds of issues. The expectation as to licenses is that the state will issue the first round of dispensary licenses potentially as early as mid-fall. They have opened up the portal for applications for the first round of equity licenses, and we don't know how fast they will be moving with that. The state has not yet released regulations on cannabis businesses. I would note one other thing, which again, Kevin may talk more about later. One of the time, place, and manner regulations that the state has put in place, which we are bound by, is distance from what are known as sensitive uses. So in other words, a dispensary consumption lounge cannot be within 500 feet of a school, and it cannot be within 200 feet of a house of worship. It is a bit of a challenge that the state has not yet released their regulations, and we have to proceed with our local laws and ordinances despite that. But it's essential that we have our code in place before licenses are issued and people set up shop, or we will have businesses that will not be required to be compliant with whatever regulations we've established. We have been talking to other businesses or other cities around the country for lessons learned. The mayor set up this cannabis business preparation committee. He actually set it up in December when he was mayor-elect to develop recommendations. Part of that has been us talking to cities all over the country. So we learn from their mistakes and go from there. We were tasked with developing recommendations to support successful cannabis businesses in the city. And that's what you will be hearing from us today. One other note is that the city role is that we cannot be advocating for specific license holders. We can advocate for a good, fair process, but it will not be the city's role or the city council's role to advocate for specific applicants. Kevin?
Great, thank you, Linda. And just a little bit more about the Cannabis Business Preparation Committee. And I would imagine most of you are aware of this, but that committee included two council members, Councilmember Patterson and Councilmember Gruber. So thank you to both of you for your participation on that group and your insights. But as she said, we did a lot of research to other states and cities that have gone down this road. It's good that they went before us so we can learn from them. But essentially this group, we broke the committee into two subcommittees to look at zoning and regulations on one side, and then business development and education was another subcommittee. We met over a dozen times as a committee, and we also had 4 community meetings to hear from the public on these issues. And in addition, a series of sort of open houses in coordination with the Business Insight Center at the Rochester Public Library, who also participated on the committee. So we had an open house in July, and then there's another one coming up in October related to workforce development. So the city's participating in that, library's participating, but then there are other state and regional partners that all have sort of a vested interest in this industry getting off the ground that are participating in those workshops on the sort of business development side of things. The committee met for several months, and then ultimately we delivered our recommendations to the mayor at the end of June. And then he, concurred with those recommendations. We made some slight modifications, and then from there moved into translating those recommendations into legislation and actual amendments to the zoning code and other parts of the code that would need to be amended to reflect those recommendations. Now, before we get into the specifics of those, I just want to take a step back and just kind of call attention to the sort of the overarching approach here or philosophy that we took in this work. And that is a recognition that when it had the option to, the city opted in to join the efforts to address all the harm that's been caused by the war on drugs and all manner of other policies federally and locally that have caused a significant amount of harm and a disproportionate amount of harm on communities of color, and in particular really restricted economic opportunities and continues to restrict economic opportunities for folks. So that's a focus that we want to play a part in that, in repairing harm there as much as we can, but also recognizing that as a municipality, there's limits to what we can do to address that. As you've heard the mayor talk a lot about, we need to be all in, and that really speaks to this issue because there are the state, the county, federal government, local nonprofits, individuals, businesses. We all have a role to play in reversing this pattern and the impacts that have come from past policies. So that's kind of our approach. And when it comes to developing specific policies, the philosophy was to minimize the barriers of entry to this emerging industry for folks, and at the same time addressing the potential impacts that they could potentially have on the community. So what does that look like in terms of zoning? We'll get into that now. And as Linda said, we are just talking about 2 cannabis business types here. That's what the state has enabled us to look at, and that's dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So the approach that we came up with was that dispensaries would be considered retail sales and services. You might be familiar with that term. That is an official use that is defined by the zoning code. And then the code lists, where those uses are allowed and not allowed. So the good news is that definition fully encompassed what a dispensary is. We didn't need to modify the definition. So they're going to be considered retail sales and services and treated the same. On-site consumption lounges, similar approach, just a slight tweak because the definition of bars didn't quite encompass what an on-site consumption lounge is. So we're actually adding a new definition and a new use for on-site consumption lounges, but it would be treated basically the same, like 95% the same as bars. So, and what that means is that like retail and bars, dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges would be permitted in our commercial districts, our C1, C2, et cetera. It would not be permitted in our residential districts with a minor exception in R3. We can get into the details of that later. It's not something that would happen very often, and also a minor exception in industrial districts. But primarily, we're talking about allowing these things in our commercial districts. So I want to show you a map of what that looks like. When it comes to location, there are two layers of consideration here. The first is what we can't control, and that is what Linda mentioned earlier, the state imposed distancing requirements for sensitive uses. So a cannabis-based business, or at least a dispensary and on-site consumption lounge, cannot be within 500 feet of a school or within 200 feet of a house of worship. And we've sort of tentatively mapped that out, as you see on screen there. So that's the first layer, state imposed. And then the second layer is again, the zoning districts that we can control locally. So let me zoom into the map a little bit so you can get a better sense of what that means. And for the commercial districts where we're saying they would be permitted as of right, again, the C1, C2, et cetera, I lumped those all together into this single color, this green. So that's our commercial districts that you see on the map. And then the special circumstances in R3 would be in yellow, but again, that would be pretty rare for that to happen. And also in our industrial districts in this sort of lighter gray up here. So those are where those businesses would be permitted. But then you have to look at these darker gray areas here that reflect buffers around houses of worship and schools. So look where they're allowed, but then see where those areas might be canceled out by the presence of a house of worship or a school. This is just a sketch of a map. This is not intended to be a precise representation at this stage. The zoning districts are precise, but the sensitive uses are more of just a snapshot of approximately how much area would be canceled out. We'd have to do more precise measurements when we get to that stage. So that's the location side of things, the where side of things that we're proposing in this legislation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather Anderson to talk about how these things, this is the manner of things.
Thank you, Kevin. Can everyone hear me okay? Just want to do a quick check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's better.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I need to use my theater, my stage voice.
Yeah.
Okay, so as Kevin mentioned, I'm going to now be talking about draft regulations for dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges, or the how these businesses would operate. And also, as Kevin mentioned, the policy recommendations have been and are being translated into legislation that you will be reviewing soon. So I will be talking in terms of the amendment. So the amendment proposes requiring both business types to have a business permit. This aligns with requirements for business types such as bars and smoking establishments, and also creates the process for enforcing other regulations. It also proposes requiring outdoor lighting and outdoor security cameras. While the city does not require those security measures of retail sales and services or bars, cannabis businesses present unique security concerns because they are typically cash-only businesses. This is due to the fact that cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, and consequently federally insured banks cannot do business with cannabis businesses. And for on-site consumption lounges, the amendment proposes requiring a ventilation plan to prevent smoke dispersion into other spaces within the building, outside the building, or into nearby buildings. Next slide, please, Kevin. So the amendment, the amendment proposes that licenses and permits must be visibly posted at all times. There we go. Sorry. And that no odors shall be detectable from outside of the commercial space occupied by the business, which is, of course, to address concerns about the smell of cannabis generally. It's probably helpful to note at this point that cannabis that is distributed to dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges for retail sale will already be packaged as a requirement. And so that will likely eliminate much of the potential for cannabis odors. Next slide, please. There we go. The hours of operation in the proposed amendment mirror the hours of operation for similar businesses established by the State Liquor Authority for Monroe County. So dispensaries would have the same restrictions on hours of operations as liquor stores, and on-site consumption lounges would have the same hours of operation as bars in Monroe County. However, the amendment proposes that on-site consumption lounges will need a special permit in order to be open past 11 p.m. The special permit review process will enable a site-by-site determination of the appropriate closing time for on-site consumption lounges. The intent here was to create a similar review process for on-site consumption lounges as there are for bars. Bars are not automatically granted a 2 a.m. closing time. The State Liquor Authority reviews applications and has some discretion to determine the appropriate closing time based on location and other factors. Next slide. So during policy development, there was some discussion as to whether the city should allow outdoor areas or patios for on-site consumption lounges. City staff research found that there is very little experience in other jurisdictions to provide guidance on adequate distancing requirements or mitigation measures to address concerns about smoke dispersion impacts. So because of that, the amendment does not enable outdoor areas for on-site consumption lounges. As jurisdictions gain more experience and develop best practices for outdoor areas for consumption lounges, the city could revisit that policy. So the next steps, the zoning and regulations for dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges will be at City Council next month in September. The cannabis recommendations as a whole also included some implementation and business development strategies that will also be discussed at City Council at a later date. So that concludes our presentation. We are happy to take any questions you may have.
So I'll start off with a question, and I'm sure there's many questions from my colleagues. So first and foremost, thank you for all the work on this and bringing us up to speed on where we are. With respect to the map, one of the questions in the chat was whether or not we can get a copy or a version of it that we can digest. We understand it's not final, but just to give us a sense of where we are at this point. Could that be sent to us via email?
Yeah, in fact, I can put it in the chat right now. What I showed you was like a PDF of the map, but this is an online version of an interactive version of the draft map. So you're welcome to go in and take a look around there. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll open it up for questions from my colleagues.
I just have one question. In terms of the number of licenses, and maybe I missed that, but is that something that gets determined at the state, or would we be able to determine that at the city level?
I can speak to that. That is wholly and exclusively determined by the state. At this point, we do not have an indication that there will be a cap finally. I mean, the first round of licenses is 100 some odd licenses statewide, but it will be wholly within the province of the state as to how many they grant, where they grant them, and when they grant them.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to add to that they're saying for the first round dispensaries minimum 150 statewide, and they've expressed the intent to geographically disperse those licenses in an equitable way, but there isn't any codified measure or requirement for them to do that necessarily. So
Councilmember Gruber and Patterson, as the members of the body that served on kind of preparing some of this stuff and understanding this, are there any red flags or things that we should be concerned about as we go into this, at least the zoning process? Anything that you want to highlight or update us on that's not necessarily covered yet?
Mike, you want to start?
Well, yeah, I'll just make a comment. And so my comment is the law is very clear that anywhere you can smoke a cigarette, you can consume cannabis. So, and in some cases, from the sounds of it, it may well be even more lenient. So the notion that you won't be able to consume cannabis outside seems to be in direct contravention of the law. And I would argue that we're probably preempted. So I'm going to have some problems and some challenges with that section of it, if that's still included in it when it's submitted. So that's just a comment on my part.
Okay,
But,
and
you know,
just to clarify, we're not remotely suggesting we put in the ordinance that you cannot smoke marijuana in public places. We're talking exclusively about the issue of a business having a consumption lounge, having an outdoor space because of the concern of the impact on adjacent businesses, et cetera.
And I hear that.
So
And
I just want to be clear. I understand that there's still a disagreement on that. I do not agree that there is a preemption there. I understand there's a disagreement there, but I just want to be clear for the other council members that the ordinances we're putting forth are not in any way restricting smoking marijuana in public. The only thing that we may restrict is at a consumption lounge, that all of the smoking would have to be indoors, that indoor the lounge, not an outdoor consumption lounge.
Which we talked about a lot, Mike, and is relative to how bars are, right? You can't have people smoking cigarettes in every section of a bar, right? There has to be some type of process to have a smoking section.
Well, we simply disagree, and we'll we'll continue this conversation when you submit the legislation.
Well, I guess
Looking
my
forward to it.
I guess my comment, Miguel, to your point, I think there's two things I want to highlight. I think what Mike and Linda are talking about is a really important one. I mean, the reality is that we as council members, we're all going to hear I'm sure a lot of us are already hearing it, but we're going to hear more of it. People frustrated with how regular it is to be able to smell weed everywhere. And it's a frustration for a lot of people. I think it's a valid concern and frustration for a lot of people, but it is also in a lot of ways something that we don't really have any control over. People are going to be able to smoke weed where they can smoke cigarettes. So that's going to be something that like people are going to bring up quite a bit. And we all just need to be conscious of that, but it's a reality of the law. The other thing that I would say that I think maybe I was mostly I think people mostly disagreed with me on this, but I'll just bring it up now. I would hope, well, it's the wrong verb. I'm interested in the idea of having kind of a district where there are a lot of marijuana businesses concentrated. And I think we had the opportunity through some of the zoning to kind of force that, to kind of make that a reality. And the decision that everybody made, and and Mike was, I think, probably the most vocal about it, was that we probably shouldn't do that, because we should let everyone do what it is that they want to do in the way that they can, if they want to open a bar or a liquor store at this point. And the market will either create an opportunity for there to be a concentrated district like there is at Easton Alexander, for example, with bars, or the market won't do that. And I didn't fundamentally disagree. So it is what it is. But I do just want to highlight to council that I think there is an opportunity potentially to try to be a little bit more active. And this is a very reactive zoning proposal. We could be more active in trying to create some type of marijuana district. Like obviously High Falls comes to mind, pun intended, as a place where potentially there could be a concentration of marijuana, of sanctioned marijuana industry. That would be something that this zoning code does not do on its own. And if people want to talk about that further, I'm happy to, but that's where we kind of wound up.
All right, thank you. So any additional questions? I have additional comment, but any additional question from council members? Okay, so my comment is, and I know this isn't really the time and the place for this, but I guess I want to just put it out there for the record and then maybe even ask a question of the administration. So when it gets down to brass tacks and impact on taxation eventually, and I know we're talking about zoning and time and place and manner and all of that, but I guess I want to understand how we might, as a city, as a municipality, ensure that the impact of any revenue that gets generated, how that will eventually invest back into the communities that have been most impacted by street sales. And I think that was one of the intended desires of the state. And I know that was mentioned in the presentation, war on drugs, et cetera, et cetera. But what measures might we be putting in place in the future, if not already in the works, to ensure that we're reinvesting these dollars to have an economic impact or community impact in neighborhoods that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs?
Yeah, thank you for that, President Melendez. It's a great question and a very important issue. And I think that ultimately the mayor would like to, identify some possibilities around that once the revenue starts to come in. We opted as a committee for the last 6 or so months, we opted to not get into that too much because we felt it would be a little bit premature, having a difficult time predicting the levels of revenue that we'd be talking about. Also, that with sort of the time pressure to make sure that our zoning code is up to date and ready for when these licenses start to be issued. So we want to prioritize that. That being said, this committee or a subset of this committee or different departments that are relevant to this issue, I think are going to continue to meet and convene. And so, in order to stay on top of measuring how things are going with zoning and other things, but also to address that issue that you brought up, because that definitely came up in our research and our contacts with other states and cities that have made some decisions around that. And it's a whole variety of ways that they've looked to reinvest those funds. If we can make that decision locally. So I think there's a lot of room to have those discussions moving forward after we get the zoning taken care of.
And to that point, I would encourage everybody the administration can share back out to all members of council the recommendations of the Ruby report. That was one of its main goals and duties. All council members should be able to review that. I'm sure I've got a draft copy around in the original somewhere, but either way, I know DT finished off the final report and we should be able to get that out and know that that was the specific purpose of the Ruby Commission. So there's that.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder as well, Councilmember Patterson. So Councilmember Pio, you had a question as well?
Yes, thank you. How do we, or how will we, or how can we really regulate social clubs in terms of this type of zoning here? Because social clubs, we don't really regulate much when it comes to on-site drinking. Will we be able to do anything when it comes to on-site consumption?
You're talking about a social club that won't be licensed?
Not
to-
licensed,
as
not
a
open.
consumption lounge.
Right.
I mean, we dealt with that and are dealing with that with a few places in the city that seem to feel that just by calling themselves social clubs, they can avoid having the liquor license and the entertainment license. And we just recently shut someone down like that. So I would use the same approach that my office uses for other nuisance properties. If you are not properly licensed to run as a dispensary or to run as a consumption lounge, we will take the same actions to warn you, to try to bring you into compliance, and then if necessary, to close you.
And how would we regulate whether or not a person can smell marijuana from the outside?
That is one of the many reasons that we initially stayed away from the concept of allowing outdoor smoking for consumption lounges, because I think when they're indoor, they're all going to have, we've spoken to a number of places that run in other states, they all have very good air handling, air filtration systems. So they're able to keep the odor from going up to apartments above them or to adjacent businesses. But when you're outside, it's much harder to do that. And it would become an incredibly subjective standard for a police officer to say, you know, I'll always give this example to people. I personally can smell a cigarette 2 blocks away because I really don't like that smell and I'm very sensitive to it. You know, you have one police officer who is that way with marijuana and another that isn't, and you end up with a very subjective standard of addressing those concerns. As I said, it's one of the many reasons why we decided to initially stay away from outdoor. I frankly suspect that the state, when they issue their regulations for the actual operation of dispensaries, they've issued regulations for the licenses, but they have not yet issued the operational regulations. I suspect they're going to say that there can be no outdoor because in most other states it's not allowed. But I think having it does create a very difficult standard.
I will just add to that there's the two issues, that there's a smoke issue, which again for the indoor, the recommendations include having a ventilation plan, and we do have good examples of what that could include from other jurisdictions. And then there's the general smell of cannabis, which I think gets to what Linda was talking about, can be a very subjective thing. But in the legislation, it includes that odors cannot be detectable outside the building. And what we see in other jurisdictions that have an effective implementation or enforcement of that is when a business applies for, say, a business permit, that they show their odor control strategies or have an odor control plan that can be enforced. There's some jurisdictions that that will say you have to have a certain number of nuisance calls about odor before you have to have strategies. And I think because we know that that can be such a subjective thing, we don't want to really rely on that. We want to be a little proactive as much as we can with odor control.
So when it comes to allowing pretty much, if it's in the same area as a bar, it could be approved. What about the bars that, I don't know how many around the city. I know one in Gates, but one that's been grandfathered in to allow smoking indoors with the drinking. Would they also automatically be approved for smoking indoors?
So, well, this is a question for Linda, but we know that one of the things that's in the state law is that anyone who's licensed to sell cannabis cannot also sell alcohol. So you can't be a licensed cannabis dispensary or on-site consumption lounge and also sell alcohol, but Linda might have some.
So these are going to all be new businesses, so they're not going to be grandfathered into anything.
Okay. Because I've seen bars that have additives to beer. So are we not allowing that quite yet, or we're not sure of that quite yet?
Those are not legal.
All right.
And they never will be in all
I
likelihood.
heard from a friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
No, I mean, you could walk around the city and see many operations that are running not within the confines of the law.
and businesses that sell alcohol won't be able to be licensed to sell cannabis because that's already in the state law for sure.
Okay, so no bar can sell cannabis.
Exactly.
No.
What about CBD? Is that beyond this scope?
CBD is not within the murder law. That's a whole separate set of regulations. I'll be honest with you, we have not focused on them because that's not been a concern. They've been treated just like any other retail.
Okay. Maybe that's what I was thinking then, for the additive thing.
Yeah.
All right, final word
Thank
on
you.
this, Councilmember Patterson, and then we're going to move on to the arts piece.
Actually, not a word, just a request. Corporation Counsel, could you give the short course on preemption so folks will understand what that means?
You want me to explain a little bit about it now?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Just very briefly, I could take out one of my law school lectures and then you'd all fall right asleep. I can give it to anybody if they're having insomnia problems. The basic concept of preemption is if there is a state law that has statewide application, a local government cannot adopt a law that is contrary to that law. So if the state says we are regulating a certain subject and we are regulating it, the entire field of that subject, we cannot contravene, we cannot act on that at all. If the state says we are adopting a specific law on a subject and it will be statewide, we cannot act on that as well. Which is why we are sort of in this little bit of limbo, because we're going to propose these regulations, which we have to put in place so we have something there when these businesses get their applications. And if the state at a later time adopts either a statute or a regulation that is contrary, that is statewide, nobody will be grandfathered, nothing. Ours will be null and void. And anyone who wants the full lecture, I'm happy to send it to you.
All right, thank you for that.
Miguel,
And-
Miguel, before you move it over, let me,
Yeah.
I just want to close by this section by just thanking Kevin and Heather and Linda and everybody else in the administration. This was a very good collaborative process, even though there were some things that I kind of got outruled on, and Mike seemed to win a couple of our battles here. I will give credit that it was a very good, productive process.
Yes, thank you very much for the work and presentation today. I'm sure we're going to have 1,000,001 questions as we continue along, but this is a good start. So thank you for the work. With that, let's move on to the arts policy piece. Kevin, am I turning it back to you again?
Yep.
All right.
Okay, let me share the screen here 1 second. My Zoom does not like this setup. Okay, so shifting gears now for something completely different. We have a number of different arts initiatives that we've been working on through the mayor's administration and through multiple departments that we want to give you an update on. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these are going to be things that come before council as a body in the not too distant future, and other things are just things we want to make sure that you're aware of that are happening and would welcome your perspectives and your feedback on these initiatives. So I'm going to cover a handful of things today. So let me give you some quick backgrounds as a refresher. Most of you probably know that we have a city arts policy on the books that's also known as the Percent for Arts, adopted back in 2007, slightly amended in 2009. But essentially, this is the policy on the books that says that we as a city are going to set aside 1% of total development costs for capital projects that are above $1 million to create a pot of money, if you will, to fund public art. So for example, if there's a $2 million street improvement project, that's a capital project, it's above $1 million, we would set aside 1% of those funds to go towards public art. And this policy is set up in a way that we would not be restricted or constricted to create that public art on that particular street project, that rather that fund is really for public art throughout the city, not just on that location. So that's kind of been on the books for a while, but as you know, it really hasn't been utilized very much for more than 10 years. There really hasn't been a clear process put in place for how to administer those funds, nor has there been dedicated staff or a clear internal champion to sort of run with that and bring that program to life. There's been some funds that have been spent, but it just hasn't been consistent. In any case, that has started to ramp up in recent years, starting with the adoption of Rochester 2034, our comprehensive plan in 2019. And as you'll recall, there's an entire section of that plan dedicated to arts and culture, has a variety of goals and strategies listed for this particular issue. But it specifically talks about sort of jumpstarting this Percent for Arts program and becoming more of a city of the arts and for the arts. So in 2021, Mayor Warren convened a group together of some local artists, some stakeholders within the arts community to start to work on these things. And she asked myself and city planning to help convene that group. And that became the AC3, which stands for the Arts and Creative Community Committee. That's the AC3. So myself and some other city staff have been working with them for over a year now. The co-chairs of that group are well-known artists, Annette Ramos, Thomas Warfield, and Sean Dunwoody, and then a dozen or so other artists and representatives of local arts organizations. They've been really wonderful to work with. And we've been working with them on a few different initiatives that we'll go through today. But then parallel to that, we developed a more formalized internal team, a diverse group of folks from a diverse group of departments that are relevant to public art, called the City Arts Team, or the CAT. And so that team meets with the AC3 on a somewhat regular basis to work on these different initiatives. So that's sort of the groundwork and the framework for addressing these things. And now I'll get into the different things that we are working on together. So four different primary efforts that I want to mention. As you'll recall, the Arts and Cultural Council of Greater Rochester dissolved a couple of years ago. That's a huge loss for our community. Most cities that are real serious about investing in the arts have some sort of not-for-profit arts organization that's like an arts alliance or arts advocacy group that is sort of the go-to organization for this particular issue. And with that group dissolving, we've been in very early conversations with a number of different groups and individuals about how we might fill that void and how we might sort of restart that effort to replace the Arts Council. So those conversations are underway. We have some great partners with the AC3, some local institutions, some individual artists that are part of that conversation. And we hope to give you more updates on that as things evolve. The second big initiative that we're working on that hasn't quite started yet, but we have a concept in mind, and that's the development of an arts and cultural plan for the Rochester area. And again, this is something that's common to most other cities that are investing a bit in the arts and cultural scene. And that's essentially kind of like a strategic plan or a comprehensive plan that is dedicated just to arts and culture. So we would identify, who we are as a community, what are our assets, who do we want to become as a community and better support the arts community, and then what are the strategies that we would take to get there. So similar kind of framework as Rochester 2034, just focused more on arts and culture and that sort of ecosystem. So we intend to work with a consultant that specializes in the development of those plans through the release of an RFP in the coming months. So when it comes time to, hopefully award money to that consultant in a contract, that's something that would come before council probably in early 2023. So the third one I want to mention here is going back to the Percent for Arts program that we're working on. You probably have heard that at the end of July, we released 2 RFPs, sort of a twin RFPs for the Percent for Arts program. And essentially we're trying, rather than the RFPs looking for artists or proposals for public art, because we don't really have the staff like other cities do dedicated to this kind of thing. This is stuff that, work that city planning and other groups are sort of working on in addition to all the other things we're responsible for. A lot of other cities have dedicated staff to this sort of thing. In the absence of that, we want to find a pair of organizations that will help us administer these funds. So we've got $100,000 set aside for a mural program and another $100,000 set aside for any other public art that's not a mural. And we've worked closely with the AC3 and the City Arts team to develop these RFPs, and they will be involved throughout this process. And again, we'll contract with an organization to administer those funds. And then later, probably sometime this winter, those selected organizations would then do a call for art. So it's almost like a 2-stage RFP. Find the organization first, then later they do a call for artists, and the city will still be involved at that point, helping them through that process. But they would do sort of the heavy lifting of administering those funds. So again, that would come before you likely in early 23 in terms of awarding those contracts to organizations. And then the last thing I want to mention that is going to come to ideally the next city council cycle in October or after the September one, is amending the arts policy that I mentioned earlier. So the way it's set up right now is those funds are exclusively used for capital projects, so physical public art installations. In working with the AC3 and the City Arts team and others, it's clear that there are a lot of other wonderful forms of public art that are not capital in nature. They could be temporary, they could be rotating, sort of changing over time. They could be more performance art in nature, educational in nature, things that are not capital physical presence, but they are, have a public benefit. So we would need to amend the arts policy in order to enable the use of those operating funds, essentially, to fund those things in the future. That doesn't affect the program that we just rolled out right now, these 2 RFPs, but we would like to have this amended for future iterations of that as we use those percent for arts funds so that they're more flexible and can be used for different kinds of public art. So those are the 4 main things that we're working on as a group. A lot of exciting things happening. Want to give you an update on that and a heads up on what might be coming before you. And with that, we're happy to get your perspectives on those things and hear more from you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. Just a question on the percent for art funds piece of it, and we're seeing your screen, by the way.
Yeah, my stop share went away. Where'd it go? Give me a second. There it is. It hit on me. Go ahead.
No worries. So for the percent for art funds, I know that generally it hasn't generated a ton of resources. So I remember last year it was around 240 something thousand that was set aside for this. Can you maybe talk about how you project the amendment to increase the resources that are available to the arts community, if that's the intention, and what we might expect there?
Sure. Yeah, so the amendment would not necessarily increase those resources. It would make them more flexible to tap into operating funds and not just capital funds. So the amount each year would still be based on that calculation of 1% of total development costs of capital projects over $1 million. That being said, other cities have done this, whether it be driven by council or the administration or both. The opportunity to look for additional money within the budget to augment that. That is certainly a possibility. But in terms of the amendment itself, it wouldn't necessarily change the amount.
Thank you. So with that, I'll open it up to my colleagues. Any additional questions at this time?
Yeah, I have a couple.
Councilmember Gruber?
So I guess I'll start with this one. So you opened up, Kevin, by talking about we've had this policy on the books since 07 or 08 or something like that.
Yep.
And that it essentially has not been adhered to, which is it's kind of frustrating to hear. I'm sure that's frustrating for people who were excited about the win in 07 when, by the way, being on city council wasn't a twinkle in my eye at that point. I just want to be clear about that for you. And one of the reasons that you said that it hasn't really been administered is because we don't really have the staffing to administer it. So what changes? I mean, I understand that we have this mechanism for the RFP process, and that's good, but that's good because it has your eyes on it at the moment and a planning team that has people who've been working on this. How do we make this so that it doesn't go away again?
Yeah, and to that point, I should have mentioned earlier that city planning's role in this is really sort of kind of in an interim fashion of carrying the torch until something more solid is put in place. But ultimately, that's a decision for Mayor Evans and certainly for all of council to consider and discuss the possibilities there to dedicate funds and dedicate staff in the future to do that sort of thing. But that's above my pay grade to make that decision. But what I will say is that's a potential outcome of this arts and cultural plan that we'd like to develop. Because in addition to looking at the broader arts ecosystem for the Rochester area, we would like that plan to make recommendations for City Hall and how we might be able to dedicate more resources to becoming more of a city of the arts and for the arts. And that could be in the form of additional staff. It could be in the form of additional funds. It also could be in the form of a very common model, which is the establishment of an arts commission, which would be like a board, a city sanctioned board, like we have our ZBA or CPC, that functions essentially as a curator of public art on city property. That's what Buffalo has in place, Syracuse, Pittsburgh, other cities have that in place. Again, above my pay grade to say whether we should or shouldn't, or to make that decision, but that's an example of a way that we could further our investment in this and stabilize it in years to come.
Yeah, and I certainly wasn't trying to put you on the spot to make that
I know.
decision, but just so that I'm clear, the stuff that you guys are bringing to us to vote on in the next couple of months does not come with a recommendation like that. We are, in other words, we are focused on how to spend money that we have available now and how to do our best with the resources we have, but we are not being proposed by the administration a long-term solution at this point.
That's correct.
And Deputy Mayor, is that something that you think will come eventually?
Yes. I think it is a priority for the administration to get the whole, and it's an interesting community, as I've come to learn, is to try to get a community-wide organization that would be the Arts Alliance. So I envision it as two. You have the Arts Alliance, which is a group of people who are concerned about the art. Then you have the Art Commission, which is the entity that's going to fund a lot of the art in the community, and that funding has to have a little bit more control on the city. So I will tell you, we don't have an exact plan worked out yet, but it's something that we will be doing over time. And the fact that Kevin, I give him a lot of credit, has taken up this mantle and run with it, you know, and really brought it into the forefront, and is working obviously very closely with me and others to see how this thing could develop. And so, and I think we'll also, this consultant will be probably very helpful in putting together what the long-term structure should look like. We had some interns from the U of R, and we tasked them with looking at all of these other cities and how they're structured and how they're, and so we have some of that data that we're working through. So we'll have something eventually, I hope.
Yeah. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And I'll add to that too, that we are in early conversations or just exploring the potential for involvement from Monroe County as well as a partner in all this. So that could look a few different ways, but that's something we're also looking at.
Okay, that was my next, I mean, it wasn't going to be a question as much as a point. I mean, to me, it feels like if we are actually going to talk about city-county partnership, real, tangible partnership that people feel in this community, this is a really easy foray to start. Probably a lot easier than some other places. And I really, I'm encouraged that those conversations are happening. And I appreciate everything you said, Deputy Mayor. The only thing that I would add is a minor caveat to what you said at the end, that you hope there's a solution. I mean, I think we need to offer something. I'm not saying by October, but we need to offer something to the arts community, who I think has rightfully so felt like they have just not had a willing ear on the other side of City Hall after a ordinance was passed in 2007 and not really acted upon for a while. So I think it's our job to make that right, and I'm hopeful this is a first step. So I appreciate it.
Thank you for that. Councilmember Pio, do you have any additional questions at this time?
No, sir.
All right, so we've hit this almost on the nose, hour-long session. So thank you very much to the administration for presenting on both fronts today. Greatly appreciate the information. I'm sure we'll have questions. Look forward to getting some of this stuff in upcoming cycles so that we can review, ask additional questions, and move forward. But thank you.